Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, which is being presented by the Open University in Scotland on behalf of a partnership with the universities of Parma and Glasgow Caledonian, Glasgow and Edinburgh. You're very welcome and thank you for joining us. This event is being recorded. Please use the chat box for any questions, and if you see a question that you like, please like it, and that will help the people behind the scenes decide which questions to refer to our speakers. You can follow us on social media, please, at OU Scotland or at OUB School for the Open University Business School, or at OU_FBL for the Faculty of Business and Law. After the event, we'll send out the recording along with a question for response. We'd really appreciate your feedback. We'd like to build a coalition, a force for change. We've already got a lot of people participating in this webinar who are making a huge difference. We'd like to keep this relationship going. So I'll start by just introducing myself very briefly, and then I'll go to the first speaker. And again, we'll just let the speakers introduce themselves. They've each really got a 15-minute segment for the three projects. They'll probably speak for 10 minutes, so there'll be some time for questioning, and then we should have half an hour at the end for all of the presenters on a panel. So you should have a chance to have a question asked. And if we can't answer it this afternoon, if there isn't time, one of the presenters will get back to you if you contact the organisers or if we've got your details through the chat box. So I'm Simon Lee. I'm pleased to be here. I'm Professor of Law at the Open University. The first Chancellor of the Open University said on receiving the Royal Charter that we are open to people, places, methods and ideas. That was the phrase he used. And I'd like to say that if you're not open to an English voice chairing, I understand that. I've got two very small claims to be doing this. One is that we had a year of migration, we called it, in 2018, which was my idea. And together with others, we produced a daily blog post, 250 posts from different people, including migrants and community groups, about migrants and migration. One of the early ones I wrote, I took an extract from an undergraduate dissertation by Jenny Lee. Now, my name is Simon Lee. She's no relation. Jenny Lee, of course, is the famous MP from Scotland, who was really the political creator of the Open University together with Harold Wilson. And I found in the Open University archives, when I was researching for my inaugural lecture, that she had been studying at the University of Edinburgh in the 1920s. She was studying three subjects, law, education and psychology. And in psychology, they could do an experiment and write a dissertation. And she chose an experiment in prejudices. And you can see it if you just look at Year of Migration. You'll find it easily enough. It's in the chat box as well, but you'll find it by searching. And what she did was to ask school children in 5 different locations around Scotland what they thought of people from different countries. And she listed all the countries in the world. There are about 45 or 50 students at each location, school pupils. And she said, if poverty and war are to be abolished, the schools must make it their duty to search for and destroy harmful antisocial germs in the minds of children as rigorously as disease germs are removed from their bodies. And at the moment, we're neglecting that, which means that we've still got the prejudices that made 1914 possible. To test this deduction, I carried out an experiment with 5 groups of children in varied environments: a rural area, a small town, a large town, a mining village, and an aerodrome centre. By the way, if anybody would like to repeat this experiment or develop it or make it more rigorous, she accepted it wasn't scientifically rigorous. The children given this list of nations asked what they thought of the inhabitants of each country and why. And she concluded that the results were alarming in the degree to which they revealed the prejudices already stamped on the young mind by its home and school environment. What an indictment of our educational system, she wrote, that only 2 out of 222 children had learned to do their own thinking and to reply in most cases that they had no opinion as they did not know enough to form one. What a superb answer from those two children. So that's what we mean by being open to people, places, methods, and ideas. We need to recognize when we don't know enough about migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, one another. And in that same spirit, my other attempt to rescue something from obscurity was again for an article I was writing to find a lecture which had been completely neglected since it was given in 1961 by Lord Denning. It was called Borrowing from Scotland. And he quoted from a newspaper in 1746, the classic example of prejudice against people from a different background. The newspaper said, it was more or less, they come over here taking our jobs. What they actually said was, in 1746, they have pounced upon us like swarms of locusts into every quarter and every scene of life. And when there is anything to be got, you may be sure to find a number convened like hounds over a carrion or flies in the shambles. Now, who was the English newspaper talking about? Yes, they were talking about Scottish people. And in particular, they were talking about a rumour that a Scot called William Murray was, horror of horrors, going to be made a judge in England. And Lord Denning mentions this because that person did become a judge. He actually became the Lord Chief Justice of England. And most people writing about the legal system of England and Wales have forgotten this person was Scottish, because William Murray took a different title when he became a Lord. He was Lord Mansfield, one of the most praised judges of the legal system of England and Wales, and famous for the Somerset case, the release of a slave, the right to free speech in the John Wilkes case. And Lord Denning went on to say that in every era, then and since, the best judges in the legal system of England and Wales were from Scotland. He quoted Sir Thomas Erskine, Lord Campbell, and Lord Blackburn. And every time they were being appointed, the English newspapers resented the idea of a Scot who turned out to be a great judge, having that opportunity in the legal system. So that's the kind of thing I do in my day job, discover these things and try to get law students in particular, but the wider world in general, to be open to people, places, methods and ideas. And in that spirit, this afternoon, let's get on with hearing from the different projects. And we're going to begin with a colleague from the University of Parma, who knows Scotland well, Professor Simone Baglione, who's going to speak first on behalf of the University of Parma and Glasgow Caledonian. Simone.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thanks for such an inspiring introduction, and also thanks to the Open University for this event, for the opportunity to present even very briefly, our research project. As you said, I'm in Parma now in Italy since 1 year, but I'm quite familiar with the Scottish, let's say, environment, for having lived and worked in Glasgow for almost 10 years. Today, I'm presenting some very quick findings from a research project which is called, as you said, SIRIUS, which stands for Skills and Integration of Migrants, Refugees and Asylum Applicants in European Labour Markets, which has investigated for 3 years what are the barriers, what are the problems and the issues that newcomers, different type of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, or so-called economic migrants, find in their path towards sustainable and decent employment. And next slide, please. The SIRIUS project started with Glasgow Caledonian as a coordinator, and with myself, and Francesca Calo is going to speak as well in this afternoon as the team in charge of the project. As I said, the SIRIUS investigated why employment-wise some newcomers, in particular asylum seekers and refugees, but not only, also women, migrants, women joining Europe for family reunification reasons, have more difficulties in finding jobs, or in finding the jobs for which they have qualifications, or for which they had developed an important experience in their country of origins. We have done so by, as an academic project, as researchers, by collecting different type of data, quantitative and qualitative. So by speaking with people, with migrants themselves, with public officers, with civil society organizations, with unions. But we've also tried to be a bit more creative than what we are, at least myself, in my ordinary life. And therefore, we have also produced a documentary, which is entitled Work In, and which gives voice and face to the migrants who have decided to share their life and their experience with us. The documentary is available online on our website, and we've chosen purposively to give voice to successful stories, because I'm going to highlight some of the challenges we have met, we have found as an evidence in our research, but we have also found many people that experienced a successful labor market integration, perhaps overcoming the challenges I'm going to speak about, but also due to, let's say, their own capacities or the capacities of an ecosystem to support them and to enable their willingness and their capacities. SIRIUS has been, let's say, investigating these issues in 7 countries, in Denmark, Switzerland, the Czech Republic, Greece, Finland, Italy, as I said before, the UK, and we have also covered the EU level. Therefore, while the presentation following mine will focus on the UK or on Scotland in particular, I'm going to speak a bit, let's say, to provide a little bit a broader overview of the situation across these 7 countries. Before I move to the next slide, let me remind that we have also created an app which is called Work In. You see the image at the bottom of the slide, which is a serious game. So it's an app which comes from free for download on all Android device on Google Store or Google Play, and which has the aim, we have built it along with migrants and civil society organizations working on labor market integration of newcomers, which has the aim to support newcomers navigate the new, for what is for them, a new country, social and then labor market, employer, work-related environment. And we really hope that this helps and this really provide a useful tool to learn information, not only about workers' rights, which are very important information to be conveyed when someone is new in a country, but also work etiquette and behavioral issues, which sometimes employers actually point at weaknesses that they are trying to find a solution for when hiring newcomers or even young people who are new in the labor market. Next slide, please. So now we have investigated and clustered barriers to integration located at 3 levels. The first one refers to the legal and policy aspects of migration. So basically, how do our countries frame migration and how do, let's say, the way we are labeled by our European national juridical systems in terms of our, let's say, migration status has an impact on the capacities that we have to join and to be fully part of the labor market. I'll go back to this later on. There are also barriers related to societal issues. You mentioned this before, xenophobia, discrimination, but also the lack of social networks that are so important to gain employment in all countries. So Europe doesn't make an exception in here. And barriers that are related to individual capacities, to the capacities to learn or to even already speak the language of the country, but also limits to our capacity to perform as workers that are related with our psychological state, with our well-being. And as we know, many newcomers, in particular asylum seekers and refugees, have to pass through violence and trauma, which requires extra action to be overcome. I just focus on the legal aspect of very quickly. I have only a few minutes, and I want to focus a little bit on the COVID, which is the other important part of this panel discussion this afternoon. But why I focus on the legal action, on the legal aspect? Because first of all, in order to, the first step to be part of the labor market is to have the right to join the labor market and to have the right to join those services or those actions that are conducive to employment. Many newcomers do not have the right to work. Asylum seekers, for example, as we know, we are speaking about the UK here today, although, as I said, I have a broader vision in mind. As we know, in the UK, there's a very long spell of time before asylum seekers can work, at least 1 year, but normally it lasts more than 1 year. And not having the right to work for 6 months, as it is the case in many European countries, 1 year, even 2 years, is obviously a big deterrent towards what we call integration in the labor market, because in the 2 years' time, the person, every one of us would not only, let's say, lose or may lose motivation, but could also have some of the skills, let's say, deteriorating. And there is also the risk that in this long period of, let's say, during which newcomers are banned from work, they could actually accept work in an irregular or, let's say, in a non-ordinary manner, which exposes them then to risk of exploitation and so on. So the first issue which we really found as a key barrier is this. Now, I only focused on the right to work, but there are other important rights, for example, access to language classes. In the UK would be ESOL, but in similar in other countries, depends also on the type of status, the legal status that the country give to you when you arrive. Another important barrier is the recognition of skills and qualification, and even educational achievements acquired in the home country. Everyone who works with newcomers, being a civil society organization, a newcomer herself, or even a civil servant, knows that to prove and to be able to, let's say, recognize skills is a very long, tortuous, and even expensive period, which basically as an outcome results in most of newcomers having to start from scratch into their job, let's say, career. Even people that have had an important history of, let's say, professionalization. We have seen during the COVID pandemic that in many European countries, there has been an exception to this status of non-recognition of earlier educational achievements of skills with the speed up process of people working in the health sector, so nurses or doctors, refugees who were, let's say, speeded up in many European countries to take up jobs because we needed further, let's say, people working in those sectors. But normally it doesn't happen. And I think that we are all aware that that sort of emergency should in fact be the normality, that when people join with their skills, with their job, these are recognized and there are transferable, let's say, mechanisms to bring these people back into their job, also for the well-being of the country hosting them. Now, how does COVID...
Simone,
yeah.
Sorry, can I just make a couple of points just very briefly, and then we'll come back to Simone. One is that you can ask questions in the chat box now. The other is there's tremendous interest in the app. Again, if you look in the chat box, you'll see the name of the app is Workeen, as in WORKEEN. And Simone is just going to round off his presentation, and then there will be a question or two. Sorry.
Okay, so no problem. Yeah, the app, it's really up there. You find it on your Google Play on your mobile. It only works with Android, as I said. But it's if you're interested, I can provide further information because it's quite a complex, let's say, app. In this, it's very simple to be used, but there's a lot of material that we have put in this app, which, as I said, has been designed with migrants and civil society organizations. So if you have questions, then in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer. Next slides. I only have, I think, a couple of minutes, so I'll try to run through. How does COVID has impacted on this complex situation? Well, first of all across, I forgot to say something important, and I'll say it now because it also applies to the COVID scenario. We have been studying 7 countries, as I said before, which are very different in terms of, let's say, tradition of policy making on migration, history of migration, approaches to diversity. Countries that are like the country where I am, Italy or Greece, or the UK or Finland, Denmark, so the famous Nordic, so-called Nordic model of integration, country like Switzerland. However, regardless of this diversity of traditions, conditions, and policies, the same challenges, so those that I mentioned before, do apply to all these countries equally, I would say. And the COVID effect applies as well in almost all its points at the same manner across the countries. Well, the first, let's say, impact of COVID has been that many newcomers, many migrants was in those sectors which were hit by the lockdown, so by the consequences of the pandemic, tourism, retail, domestic work, leisure, and therefore many found themselves in unemployment. Because of, in many cases, also related to those difficulties in the legal status that I mentioned before, many migrants work on non-standard form of employment, like part-time or, let's say, a fixed-term contract. They couldn't access the same type of support schemes that nationals or those permanently employed could take from, and therefore their income and their economic situation has dramatically deteriorated. On the contrary, those who could keep their job because they were working on the healthcare or personal care sector, or the famous, I'll say the famous because the pandemic has led, I think, every one of us to understand how people working on the logistics and parcels are important to our life, delivering to our door many of the services and things we believe are relevant for our work or for our life. Well, all these people could not working always in condition in which social distancing was important. Can we just stay on the other slide? Sorry, and then I'll go to the conclusion in a minute.
1 minute, Simon.
Yeah, 1 minute. Okay. And then where let's say they couldn't maintain social distances, so there has been a high contagious rate. Just a word for those who were refugees and asylum seekers. In countries which used camps, like Greece, in our 7 countries, they found themselves basically locked down in all senses. So secluded in camps with very, very limited conditions and opportunities. And those who were actually in countries like the UK found themselves also deprived of services, either classes or the possibility to take courses was reduced to online with various problems that we can discuss later on, which were reported to us. So even, let's say, the services that kept going during COVID, although much appreciated, obviously were not such effective as they were in the pre-COVID era. So which means that after 2 years almost of this dramatic situation, people that arrived just before COVID have found themselves in a sort of a trap in which they have very little instruments to escape through a decent job.
Okay,
and now
Simone,
I think my time is gone.
Yeah, we're going to have to go straight to Tim's presentation, and then people can have that question exchange with Simone, who can also add any further comments after the other presentations. Thank you very much, Simone. I've also been asked to make clear, if you didn't see those slides, that you get a picture initially of the presenter, and you probably have at the bottom of your screen slides, and click on that. So now over to Tim Peace from the University of Glasgow, speaking on behalf of the project with Glasgow and Edinburgh. Thank you, Simone. Over to you, Tim.
Okay, hello everybody. I hope you can hear me and see me okay. So I'm going to be speaking today about another project called GLIMER, which has actually just recently finished. We started in 2017 and the project finished earlier this year. And the project is called The Governance and Local Integration of Migrants and Europe's Refugees. Today, I'm only going to be speaking about one small part of that project, which was about the labour market access for refugees, particularly in Scotland and other countries in Europe. I'm only going to speak about Scotland today, but the project was much wider. We also looked at Sweden, Italy and Cyprus, but today, of course, I will only speak about Scotland. And in particular, I'm going to be speaking about the main findings from a report that we wrote on labour market access. Next slide, please. So what we found out, I mean, I'm obviously giving you just a very brief overview, obviously, in this short presentation. And if you want to know more, I would encourage you to read the report. But as you're probably aware, in Scotland, if we're thinking about labour market access for refugees and asylum seekers, well, first of all, as Simone already mentioned, asylum seekers are, of course, not allowed to work while they are still applying for asylum. So all that I'm going to say today is based on those who are refugees, who have refugee status, and who have the right to work. There is a lot of information in the report, again, about the specific situation of asylum seekers, but today I'm going to concentrate on refugees. And our research was very much focused on the Scottish context. So although we're all aware that it's the UK government that sort of specifies whether people can work or not, we were interested in what the Scottish government can do, but also what local authorities can do to help refugees into work. So, and the Scottish government, of course, has powers over skills training, business development, and such like. So, there's plenty to look at there. Now, one of the key things we found, and this has come out through other reports and other research as well, is the fact that the provision of employability services specifically aimed at displaced migrants and refugees, that is quite patchy across Scotland. It's usually provided by third and public sector bodies, and a lot of that work is concentrated in Glasgow, for obvious reasons as well, because of the fact that Glasgow is the only location in Scotland that is receiving asylum seekers, for example. But of course, the landscape in Scotland has changed over the last few years, given the fact that thanks to the refugee resettlement programme, the UK's resettlement programme, there are now communities of refugees across the whole of Scotland. So things have moved on a little bit in the last few years, although a lot of the services available are still very much based in Glasgow. And another thing that we really wanted to bring out in the report was not just about the provision of employability services per se and training people up, but was also to put a focus on the importance of setting up small businesses for refugees, and the fact that actually a lot of people from that background are very much interested in setting up their own business, and there's not a lot of work that's gone into that. And also there seems, from our perspective, to be a lack of work and lack of attention on not just looking at the refugee side of things in terms of building people's skills up and training them in English language and the rest of it, but also from the other side, what can employers do, or how can employers be helped to know the benefits, for example, of employing refugees. And one of the things, a big thing that came out of the research was the fact that many employers are often wary of employing people who have refugee status because they're not sure whether that's allowed and they don't want to get into trouble. So this was a big thing. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm going to go through now are some of our key findings and recommendations, and I've separated those into, first of all, employability, and second of all, enterprise and small businesses. So in terms of our findings on employability, as I've already mentioned, it is quite limited in terms of the employment, specialist refugee employment services in Scotland. And what you find is that there is what we could describe as a two-tier geography of support for refugees who are actually seeking such services. Most of it is still very much concentrated in Glasgow. Many people will have perhaps heard of, for example, Bridges programs, which was one of the specialist agencies that provides a lot of this training. So that is still very much based in and around Glasgow, or if not in the central belt, so a lot less services obviously outside of those areas. On the other hand, it just so happens that in some local authorities who have taken in refugees, they've been able to provide themselves very sort of intensive and very well equipped employment services, but that's basically been done just on the level of that local authority, and it's not necessarily available for people in neighbouring local authorities. So nationwide, we can say that support mechanisms are very much inconsistent and precarious. Sometimes that means, sort of limited funding streams. So where there has been success, and in our reports we try and highlight a few examples where we sort of show, examples of good practice. That has been the result of kind of intensive local activity and the sort of the intense work that's been done by particular teams at a local authority level, rather than any kind of national policy framework. And one example that often comes up and that we look at in our report as well is what they've done, for example, on the Isle of Bute, where they've had a number of successes, particularly in terms of starting up businesses led by refugees. It's also quite noticeable that amongst the employability programs that are available, there's really nothing that's tailored specifically to the needs of refugee women, and our research really shows that actually there does need to be something specific. Refugee women face specific barriers which I know need to be taken into account. So there's a real kind of lack there. There was briefly one program that was set up by Oxfam, which was in fact very popular, but unfortunately they had to suspend that as well. So there's a real kind of gap there. And just generally, there's little funding available for employability support, and the support that is available is very much vulnerable to the current context we're in, both in terms of being post-Brexit and the fact that EU sources of money are sort of drying up, and of course the reality that we're in now in terms of COVID and the fact that public money itself is belts are being tightened and so forth. So it's going to be quite a struggle. Next slide, please. So in terms of the key findings for business enterprise, we found again that there's an inconsistent sort of support across the country. Business Gateway, which obviously is the organisation which provides enterprise support at the local level, that is very much patchy and depends on kind of where you are. There's a bit of a kind of a postcode lottery there in terms of the quality of support that you will get. Again, this is something that comes out very much in our report. But perhaps the key problem for refugees when they're trying to start a local business is the lack of financing options. That requires having credit history, having a business which potentially is seen as being high growth, and you need to have evidence of leave to remain that's going to cover your loan payment. So all those three factors put together mean that a lot of refugees struggle to get their ideas off the ground just because they can't get the financing. And again, in certain places, for example, I'll mention the example of Bute. They've been very good at trying to sort of put a package together and really help potential refugee entrepreneurs get their ideas off the ground. But without that kind of support, it's very, very hard. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now I realise I've got just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to speak briefly about some of our recommendations, and these are all in both the report that we published and also a smaller policy brief. So firstly, we recommend that Scottish Government policies are expanded to encompass all aspects of labour market access. So that's not just looking at employability and skills training, but also, for example, enterprise, also looking at what employers can do themselves, and really make sure there's active consideration of the specific barriers that refugees face. Secondly, we call for a national approach towards the labour market access for refugees in Scotland, but one that can be also tailored to local realities. We call for enhanced training and support for council officers who are responsible for refugee populations. And again, there are definite examples of good practice on the ground that other local authorities can look to for that. And we also call for increased resourcing for employability services and also more partnerships to be developed, not just with the third sector, which does a lot of this work, but also with the private sector. And we know that there are many businesses out there which are willing and very much interested in the idea of employing refugees. And I think there's really kind of a gap there which could be filled to sort of support the private sector a little bit more into letting them know what are the advantages of employing refugees and how they can go about that, because there is an appetite there. Next slide, please. And in terms of our recommendations for business and enterprise, we recommend taking steps to improve how business gateway branches provide support to displaced migrants when they come for enterprise and entrepreneurship support. As I mentioned before, this was very much seemed in some areas very good, and others not so much. We also call for better engagement between the national business gateway unit and COSLA's strategic migration partnership team, and I know that they already have done quite a lot of good work together. I mean, remember, of course, as well, the report that we published did come out now over a year ago, so some of this may have obviously happened in the meantime. Also, we call for improving our financing options for potential refugee entrepreneurs, for example, options for small-scale loans, revised terms of payments for refugee clients, and particularly those provided by public institutions. I'm thinking things like the Scottish Investment Bank or Business Gateway itself, for example. And then finally, we think that local authorities in Scotland should try and learn from the approach that they've taken, Argyll and Bute Council have taken, to inform enterprise success when trying to develop similar initiatives. So if you now move to the last slide, I will wrap up. So thank you for listening to me. Apologies for maybe speaking fast. It's only so much you can obviously get through in 10 minutes. But if you are interested in more about this particular topic, I would encourage you to go to the website of our project. The GLIMER website is glimer.eu, and we have all our reports and policy briefs up on that website under the output section. Please also follow us on Twitter. Even though the project has officially ended, we are still active, we are still writing things, we are still publishing things. And otherwise, I think I should probably stop there. So thanks again. And also just finally to say that this report and all the reports that we've produced, they have been done in collaboration with my colleagues at the University of Edinburgh, Professor Nassimir and Dr. Emma Hill. Thank you again.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much indeed. We've just got a couple of minutes. There's been a number of very positive comments and one or two questions. But in particular, people have welcomed the focus on entrepreneurship as well amongst migrants, and have asked, is the GLIMER project, has it been integrated with the new Scots strategy in Scotland? And more generally, the questions are, how can we come together? You talked about calling for this and that. How can we come together perhaps in an overall policy paper emerging from this?
Yeah, thanks very much. So that's a really good question about New Scots, and the answer is yes. We've very much been involved in a number of the New Scots kind of subgroups as part of the project, and both I and some other colleagues as well are also involved in what's called the New Scots Evidence Group. So this is a group of academics who come together and try to make suggestions for Scottish government policymakers, and that's been very positive, and we obviously hope to continue with that. Unfortunately, like many other things, everything has been seems to have been kind of suspended a lot because of the pandemic, and we've not been able to meet up. So I'm very much hopeful that a lot of that work will kind of start up again, because one thing that I found personally quite frustrating was the fact that just as this report actually was released, it's that lockdown happened, and unfortunately there's not been a lot that's kind of gone forward, at least in terms of the kind of the policy work. Now, I do know, on the other hand, that the people who work on this on the ground have been particularly busy throughout the pandemic and have done some amazing work. In fact, continuing, with employability stuff, with stuff about English language training. So, of course, that hasn't stopped clearly. But I think now it's very much incumbent on people like us who are working on this to really try and start again that process of trying to feed through our research to relevant policymakers. And New Scots has been very good for that. But of course, the other thing about New Scots, which is important to remember, is that there's not a lot of money and finances behind it. So a lot of the things that we're kind of calling for will require more than just sort of good intentions. But so far, we're happy with the interactions we've had.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for all the comments and questions. You can have a look in the chat, Tim, and then come back on the panel, because in particular, I think it's a good question about the relationship and partnership between universities and colleges as we help people to develop their own skills. Thank you very much. And the third and final project giving their initial thoughts is from the Open University, looking at life after Brexit and Covid, and we've got Francesca, Carol and Hilary, and I'll pass over to them. Thank you very much, Tim. Over to you, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Simon, and welcome everybody, and thank you for being here today. In this last presentation, we are going to explore our project, which investigated the experience of EU citizens in the UK and British citizens in Europe during the current pandemic. And we'll also explore some reflection for future policies. Next slide, please. So there has been an increased research interest in the experience of migrants, both in the UK and EU, in the last decades. The literature has focused on analyzing enablers and barriers to integration at both policies and service level. Less attention has actually been given to the migrant sense of identity and belonging, their role and agency in shaping their lives. Our project set out to collect the voices of EU and British citizens to explore and understand how their life, and in particular their working life, has been affected by both Brexit and COVID in the last year. For doing so, what we did, we conducted an audio survey with open-ended questions with 24 EU and British citizens. Today, we are going to explore some of the results. So I will pass the floor to Carol, Hilary, and myself again to show some of the results and to raise some of the reflection for future policies.
So the experience of migrants are influenced by many factors, but one that stands out and which is common to all nations is law. Laws help shape, create, and impact an individual's feeling of belonging within society. Legal rules and regulations are used to determine the definition of migrants, their experiences, what is permitted and what is prevented. Laws have a powerful influence on the stories of migrants, and those laws in turn are strongly influenced by policy, whether on the international stage, at state level, and within the UK at a nation level. Words often associated with migration are shown on the slide, and I'm going to briefly explore each of those in turn. In the UK government determines immigration policy as a reserve matter, and the fundamental rule of UK immigration law is an exclusionary one. In areas of devolved matters, it is possible, however, to develop policies and create rules which offer a welcoming and more inclusive environment, one which recognises individuals and the benefits that migration can create. Opportunities such as the right to vote can make a difference. Control is exercised on entry. Entry can be refused, and for those allowed to enter, permission can be rescinded or appeals disallowed. A network of ever-changing regulation acts as a control mechanism and helps create a sense of other and an uncertain existence. The general principle of equality and non-discrimination is a fundamental element of international human rights law. It has many aspects and is reflected in both international and UK laws. Human rights, which are enshrined, include right to education and a right to health. The Human Rights Act 1998 was declared as bringing rights home. It was an act to give further effect to the rights and freedoms guaranteed under the European Convention of Human Rights. One of those rights, found in Article 8, states that everyone has the right to respect for their private and family life. How much weight is given to this can depend on whether an individual's immigration status is viewed as precarious. Several policies and reports note that successful integration of migrants is key to the future well-being, prosperity and cohesion of society. Integration could be in relation to many areas, including both the workplace and neighbourhood communities. The Scottish Government argues that migration strengthens society and that Scotland benefits from the skills, experience and expertise of individuals who have chosen to live, work, study and raise their families in Scotland. Various United Nations reports have noted that migration can be a positive and empowering experience for individuals, for communities, and it can also benefit countries of origin, those of transit, and those of destination. In 2020, the First Minister wrote, "Migration is an issue which is crucial for our future economic and social well-being. We need a solution that meets Scotland's needs and allows our communities and our economy to flourish." The rules, regulations and policies we create say something of the society we wish to live in and what we aspire to be. Policies provide the opportunity to make a difference and influence the lawmakers. Behind all the laws, regulations and statistics, there are of course individuals pursuing their lives. Local communities, partnerships, local authorities and governments all play a role in integrating individuals. Organisations and authority have the opportunity to welcome and empower, enabling individuals to make contributions to their community, to the economy and wider society. Key terms here include dignity, fairness and respect. I hope this very brief exploration has helped provide some context. These words and many others help impact on an individual's sense of belonging, community, role, and the ability to shape their own lives. Their existence can be precarious, reliant on authority, and upturned by events such as Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic. And over to you, Hilary. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carol. I'm going to speak a bit about our research that's reflected in our sense of belonging and our identity of who we are. Brexit has been a protracted process that's been a source of anxiety and anguish for many of Scotland's residents, not least those from abroad who've elected to come here and make it their home. The uncertainty migrants face is being exacerbated, as we know, by other great unprecedented crisis of our time, and that's COVID-19. As a consequence, our society is being changed dramatically by this pandemic, and it's impacting on issues of identity, representation, and entitlement in the context of growing social divisions, as we've heard before, bordering and shifting boundaries of citizenship. In our research, a strong theme throughout the data was a sense of belonging, which comes from a feeling, a sense of association with a group. Belonging is about someone making a choice that they actually want to be included in a collective. And this choice is highly significant and central to the understanding of migrant decision-making, attitudes, integration outcomes, and the social identities that emerge or consolidate in the context of migration. Analysing our data, we were able to identify 3 patterns in which the dynamics of belonging unfolded. Breakaway was the first pattern of belonging we identified. It describes people who actively seek to sever existing links with their national community. Cosmopolitan, the second pattern of belonging, includes people who actively seek to establish an identity that transcends specific national communities. And this group includes people who clearly detach themselves from bounded belonging. In between, a third in-between pattern of belonging acknowledges strong links with both national and host communities. The people in this group identify strongly with both home and host community and have created for themselves links with both. Our work concurs with other authors in finding that Brexit has compelled migrants to regroup and rethink their sense of belongings, with many affiliating towards a European rights-based conception of belonging. We found acts of disenfranchisement along identity lines, which most participants, either those coming into the UK and those moving to Europe, suffer in relation to issues of independence and belonging. Questions of whether or not to stay in the UK or a European country and under what conditions have begun to surface. This, we argue, is the main impact of Brexit on the dynamics of belonging. And I'll pass back now to my colleague Francesca.
Thank you, Hilary. So in terms of COVID-19, COVID-19 added an additional layer of complexity to the lives of European Union migrants in UK and British migrants in EU. The way we connect with each other completely changed in all of our life, just to see today, both inside and outside our working practices. There was a rising level of isolation that was perceived by all participants. For example, one of the respondents said, COVID pandemic has really changed my working life and it has become more isolated. But at the same time, there was also a connection fatigue related to the lack of separation between working and life spaces. The loneliness was exacerbated by the impossibilities or the difficulties of visiting families living abroad, A lot of our participants found themselves often juggling between the needs to work in one country and the need of caring families living in another. This has really affected the health and well-being of our respondents, and in particular, the one that they had caring responsibility. However, I would like to conclude with a more positive tone of solidarity. That was highlighted by some of our respondents. There was a feeling of working together to overcome this difficult moment. And as one of the participants suggested, this feeling was regardless of nationality or whatever. Then this solidarity spirit should be used to develop better communities. I would conclude by raising some questions for the debate to understand what kind of policies and legal framework should be promoted in Scotland. How is it possible to maintain a sense of belonging to the Scottish community, the sense of belonging that Hilary discussed before? How is it possible to promote social connections, both inside but also outside our working practices? And how can we really use the spirit of solidarity to improve the place where we live? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francesca, Hilary, and Carol, and thank you to everybody who helped us over the technical difficulties. And that's given us enough time to move, I think, straight to the panel debate. So if all the presenters could put their cameras on, please. And I think the way to start is to see if each person wants to say anything which they didn't quite get to say, either because I cut them off or because another presenter hadn't said it at the point. So I'll come to Simone and Tim, and then to Francesca, Carol, and Hilary. And then we're going to have some questions from the chat box. And there's also good information going in the chat box, by the way. So please keep looking at that. Thank you. Simone, any comment on anything else you've heard today?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of interesting things. Maybe I just wanted to complement what I was saying before, which I think COVID has proved once again that we should rethink, for example, most of the services or policies that we have in place to support people in particular in period of needs. Like, for example, trying to provide, a wider and more, how can I say, inclusive way of supporting income for when people get, off work or when they are looking for work, which at the moment across Europe is much depending on the type of work you have, which, as I said, it's much depending on who you are, on the type, and if you're an newcomer, on the type of permit you have. So we would need an effort to try to, I think, mitigate this segmentation and the polarization of the society that comes reinvigorated in period of emergencies like this one.
Thank you. Tim? Oh, we can't hear you, Tim. You're muted.
Sorry, classic mistake. Yeah, I just wanted to actually pick up on some of the comments that came up in the chat. I mean, obviously, apologies, we probably won't be able to get through all of these, but Gianluca, for example, pointing to the work of his organisation, Code Your Future. So this is something we did actually come across, I remember, in the research, and I have to apologise actually, because it was one of the many organisations and people we just didn't in the end have the chance to actually speak to for the report. But it's true, I think it makes a very good point here as well about the fact that there are already a number of really good initiatives, and what we don't want to do is to try and, as you put it here, kind of reinvent the wheel. And what really needs to happen is to look at what's working already and trying to support that. Now, it's something that always comes up, right? Okay, give us more money, we need more money. But it's true, if we're not prepared to invest, and when I say we, this is Scottish Government, this is local authorities, this is various stakeholders. If we're not willing to put a little bit of money there and invest, then obviously nothing will happen. And it's true that Code Your Future, I know, has done some really great work, not just with refugees, but all people from all kinds of backgrounds in Scotland and across the rest of the country. So all I'd wanted to say is that yes, we're definitely aware of that, and I would support your call, Gianluca, for a little bit more kind of attention towards these kind of initiatives, which are essentially grassroots initiatives as well, relying mainly on volunteers and who are doing some great work and have had great results as well. So I really just wanted to sort of give another sort of not just a virtual thumbs up, but a physical thumbs up and a verbal thumbs up as well to your comments there about your organisation, which I know has done really great work.
Thank you, Tim. Now, Francesca, Hilary, Carol, you had to race through your own presentations, but was there anything that Simone or Tim raised that you wanted to touch on, or anything you've seen in the chat? First of all, Francesca.
Yeah, I just wanted to support the point that Tim was making, and as well Simone in his presentation about all the grassroots initiatives and the spirit of solidarity that I was speaking about during my presentation. I think it's in line with this, and what we find both in our research, but as well when I was doing my research in SIRIUS, is that third sector organization and all the grassroots initiatives that have been promoted in Scotland have a very key role in promoting integration, and they should be supported for doing that. And that spirit of solidarity could mean both having more volunteers, but as well creating the environment to support this organization. And I had only one point, I think, from the chat to add, that Lydia asked about if some of our respondents talk about the settlement scheme and the fear to go back to the country. I think there was a net division between the people that they had already the settlement scheme, so they were not really worried about going out and in, but they were more worried about people coming in the future. What was coming, there was a fear to go out of the country and come back, but that was more related to the employers, I have to say. So the employers, after a while, ask people to come back to the UK for work.
Okay, thank you, Francesca. Carol?
I think for me, it's about the collaboration and that grassroots movement, because law can be a pretty powerful tool to create an exclusion. But I also think that whilst we talk of this as a UK government, there are opportunities within the devolved powers of the three other governments to make a difference, and a combined effort could make quite a significant difference, because there's a big history of migration in each of those three nations.
Thank you. Hilary, there's a specific question for you, which you don't have to answer now, but you can in the chat, which is from Natasha Black, a PhD student at Ulster University, interested in exploring the link between refugee integration, citizenship and employment outcomes. Do you have any references on bounded belonging?
Actually, I do, and I'm more than happy if she cares to email me to pass those on. Absolutely.
Good, we'll sort that out behind the scene. Was there anything you wanted to add, Hilary, before I come to other questions?
Yeah, just a quick one. Somebody mentioned in the chat the issue of Scots coming back from Europe, and potentially their families being of different nationalities. And we had a really strong theme of that, both from people going from Scotland or the UK to Europe and coming back. And this real sense of fragmentation, of questioning how they can maintain themselves together as a family, and actually where they're going to be located was quite a big issue. We don't know yet if that's related to things like education or the types of profession, but it was a strong theme of questioning their sense of belonging.
Yeah. So for those, thank you, Hilary. For those who didn't see that in the chat box, it's a very interesting issue, isn't it? So suppose you're a Scot. You've decided to come back to Scotland, perhaps partly because of Brexit, but you've got family members who are from other countries. How are they being treated, and how does that impinge on what you can and can't do in terms of developing yourself and exercising your rights? Okay, what I'm going to do now, if I may, is to give 3 questions, and again, the panel don't have to all answer them, but just so that everybody participating in the webinar gets a sense of the range of questions. And to some extent, people may have covered them because some of them came earlier. But the first is, what can higher education institutions, and I would add colleges as well, do to support forced migrants to upskill, reskill, and access employment? In particular, what about the Open University and our partners and friends and those who share those values? If we're heavily engaged in this work with the Scottish government, can't we provide solutions which can be customized by relevant community organizations in partnership with migrants and communities themselves? Second question is about the settlement scheme. And it's just been touched on, this question of the fear of leaving the UK to visit family abroad. And I think that the third thing that we should look out for is about how we might do more, for instance, along the University of Sanctuary idea. And there is an open university. We're not a University of Sanctuary yet. We're in the process of trying to become one. But there's a conference run by the Open University on Monday on that. But what more can we do, those of us in this webinar, what more can we do to work in partnership? So on the first of those, would anybody like to talk about upskilling, reskilling, accessing? And then we'll come to the settlement scheme. Then we'll come to the question of University of Sanctuary and similar. And actually a fourth question which has come in is, what about the hostile environment? Why are we edging around that rather than addressing it square on? What damage has that caused? If it has, what can we do to counteract that? So I'll go back round in the same order and see if you want to answer any of those, Simone, and then Tim.
Yeah, well, I will leave the question for example, for the Open University addressed to you, obviously to you. Well, I think the university in general could do much more than what we do at the moment to support, the reskilling or even the recognitions of skills of refugees. I know that there was a pilot when I left a bit more than a year ago, Scotland. There was a first pilot for refugees educational achievement recognition and skills recognition, which was run by a colleague of mine at GCU, and I think that would have been, a good example to go along and to obviously roll it out to other institutions and universities. I think obviously this connects me to your last question. Yeah. What we can do is, as I said, we have a larger space of maneuver, so a lot of potential to tap upon on ourselves and our universities. On the other hand, if the overall framework, legal framework, is hostile, the space we have for action is very limited. And here, even in a multi-governance perspective, like Carol was mentioning before, the role that devolved governments can do. I mean, yes, of course, there is a little bit of space of maneuver that devolved governments can work on, education, for example, but as we know, I mean, migration policy in most of the countries is centralized. So the way you recognize someone with a refugee status or not is not decided by local authorities, which have since I would say many years a much more inclusive approach, but is left to central governments, which for many reasons that we are all aware have decided all across Europe to take a different path. Therefore, I think we have to be aware and realistic that there's an overall legal framework and policy framework which is not favorable to integration.
Okay, thank you.
That doesn't mean we will stop, but...
Yeah, thank you, Simone. Tim?
Yeah, no, I'd just like to pick up on actually the point that Simone was making there, and something we really try to highlight in our research is that despite the sort of the restrictions, I mean, there is an important role to play for local governments, for regional governments in particularly in other European countries as well. But obviously, again, it comes down to funding. Again, is there funding available there? Are these local and regional governments willing to put resources into these kind of schemes? Regarding the University of Sanctuary, that's also one that's relevant for me and my organisation. The University of Glasgow is also applying to be recognised as a University of Sanctuary, and I, for one, think that universities up and down the UK could be doing a lot more to try and help with this, try and do more to, the idea of upskilling, trying to make more of using, as we mentioned before, existing initiatives and trying to empower them I mean, we are very fortunate, particularly at the University of Glasgow. We have a very active research network. Graham, I'm going to do a little bit of sort of plug for now for my organisation, but we have an area, I put it in the chat there, we have an active research network, GramNet, which tries to do a lot of work with particularly third sector organisations and other NGOs, and try and sort of bring the two worlds together between sort of the world of the university and academics and people working on the ground. And of course, we would love to do a lot more of that kind of work as well. We are stretched, obviously, individually as academics, but we're hoping as well that the university, if this University of Sanctuary thing is confirmed, that there might be a little bit more scope to do that kind of work, because there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of expertise that can be shared. And I do think, yes, I'm not just talking for my own organisation, my own employer now, but I think universities, higher education institutions across the country can be certainly be doing a lot more for this and have a lot to give. So let's hope that kind of it goes along those lines. But it's also encouraging to hear about the OU potentially being part of that as well. And I, for one, are going to hopefully tune into this event that Aditya referred to, this event that I think is at Swansea University, who are going to be reflecting on their experience of being involved in that University of Sanctuary initiative. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So thank you for putting that in the chat and telling us about that event that's happening on Monday.
Thank you, Tim. Before I come to Francesca, Carol and Hilary, one of our colleagues, Lydia, and former students at the Open University in Scotland, has pointed out in the chat box that we're developing 3 projects on employability, study skills and language skills, and have put out a call for collaboration to community organisations. So you can see in the chat box to get in touch with Lydia if you are a community organisation or another college or university and you want to help on that front. Thank you very much. Francesca.
Yeah, I would like to comment a bit more about the topic of the settled status and relate this to the last point that Lydia made on the chat now. So what we found interesting in our data, it was that people that replied that they had already the settled status, they were not afraid to go out of the country, as I said before, but they had to go out of the country for carrying responsibility, but they were forced after 6 months, 1 year to come back to the UK for working reason and because the employers required to come back. So I think that there is a space in general. I mean, there will be a space to rethink what it means working from home for people that they have carrying responsibilities in other countries. And I think this is really will affect how the policy will develop if our work will be flexible forever from now onwards. And this is in a way is tangentially related to the last point that Lydia made in the chat now, that is it's about immigration law and the fact, for example, to give vote to people in Scotland, the people that they had indefinite leave to remain, so refugees, for example. What we find in our data is that EU citizens living in UK before Brexit, they always feel part of the community. They almost feel citizens, even if they didn't have the right to vote. But after Brexit, that sense of belonging changed. So they started to feel that they had to do more for being citizen. And it doesn't only mean the passport. And for a lot of our respondents, I have to say, they decided to apply for a British passport just to feel safe. But it means also like, I don't know, like finding other ways to become part of this community. So we need also to think sense of belonging, immigration law in this sense.
Thank you. And on immigration law, which Lydia has talked about, as Lydia herself knows, and others may in the webinar, we at the Open University have a project called Open Justice, which involves students all over the different legal systems in these islands, learning how to help disadvantaged citizens and migrants, offering advice, helping with legal education, understanding what people's rights are. And you can easily find that through Open Justice at the Open University or the Open University Law School. In terms of that point that a country can go beyond the minimum it can invite people to have the right to vote, and that can generate a sense of belonging. Again, if you have other examples that you'd like to put in the chat box, we'd be very grateful. Carol, did any of those questions appeal to you? And then Hilary? Sorry, Carol, we're not. You're muted.
Yeah, apologies. I think things like the right to vote are much valued, and I think whilst it might seem a small step to some, it's actually quite a large step in terms of creating that sense of inclusivity and belonging. And I was struck with the interviews of those who had the right to vote in the recent elections as to the value that they placed on it and the sense of responsibility they felt that they had as part of that wider community. So I think, you know, there are steps that can be taken, and in terms of creating an environment, I think it's the small steps and the third party collaborations that can do much to unpick that hostile environment that's often perceived from authority.
Thank you. And I can see that Louise has kindly put the link into the Open Justice Project. Hilary, any of those questions you'd like to answer?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think the point I'd like to pick up on is one that somebody made of upskilling for migrants coming into Scotland particularly. And that's something in the OU in Scotland we've been working really hard at with Upskilling Scotland. So we're just launching a micro-credential, which is on organisational development and change. But I know other colleagues in Glasgow and Strathclyde have put on courses to upskill people as well who've been furloughed and potentially lost jobs. I think where we could improve on that is perhaps opening the criteria for that funding, because my understanding is that you have to have been in Scotland for a certain period of time to be able to use that funding, which seems a pity in light of people coming into the country who potentially have no work.
Okay, thank you. The details of the conference on Monday, which is by the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and the Swansea City of Sanctuary Partnership, are now also in the chat box. I wonder if we could come to the last presentation by Francesca, Carol, and Hilary, and what you said about belonging, and if I could add something in to the debate. I used to be at Queen's University Belfast during the Troubles and the peace process. And a friend of mine, Marion Elliott, wrote about what she called the resentful sense of belonging of her fellow Catholics in Northern Ireland. And I asked her why she chose that title for a chapter in her book, Catholics of Ulster, which is somewhere around here. And she said it was a reaction to the memoir of John Dunlop, the Presbyterian moderator, which he called a precarious belonging. So what she was saying was that the majority community, if you want to call them that, Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist community, they actually felt that their sense of belonging was precarious, their sense of identity as being, you know, in shorthand terms, British. And the Catholic or nationalist grouping in Northern Ireland felt they appreciated some benefits such as education, NHS and so on of the UK state, but they were resentful of, in effect, history, meaning that they were belonging to that state in some way. And I thought this was a very interesting analysis. And it seemed to me during the Brexit saga that we were seeing that on another kind of scale, that for about a decade running up to what became the referendum, there were some noisy people who were very resentful of British citizens belonging to the EU. And then as it got closer to the referendum date, the people who had been quite confident we'd stay in Europe began to feel a bit precarious. And then the things got flipped round, given the result. And that this kind of way of analysing might apply to other circumstances, including independence referendums in different parts of these islands or the world. And in many universities, people have either a precarious sense of belonging if they are on endless short-term contracts, or if they've got tenure, they often feel resentful anyway, just because that's what we do. So you see some benefits, but you also whinge, So, but within the context of Northern Ireland majority community, or in a university, if you've got a long-term job, it's not really precarious compared to the position of migrants in a world such as the post-Brexit world and in the post-pandemic lockdown world. And so I take your different ways of categorizing belonging, but I wonder if there's something else to be said about belonging. And most importantly, my point is, so what do you do when people around you are really sad, worried, feeling precarious in their sense of belonging? So it's not to say there's any quick answer, but I'd be interested in any comments on that. Simone, Tim, and then Francesca, Carol, and Hilary again.
Well, I think I'm not, the issue of belonging should, be discussed a bit. Now we are at the end of this conference, or sorry, of this webinar, so I don't want to elaborate on that further. I'm just obviously it's an important issue, and we are constantly told that we all have multiple belongings. We're all Russian puppet sort of identity within us, and then we're constantly asked instead to choose one and to put one against the other. This is the typical life of an immigrant, which I've been an immigrant for most of my life. We are constantly confronted with, and I think obviously we need, in fact, even legal or political infrastructure which acknowledge this faceted or multi-nuanced way of understanding belonging and identity, actually.
Yeah, if I could just come in now, I mean, as Simone said, obviously the topic of belonging is such a huge one, but I think it also allows us to maybe come back to the point which we raised earlier in the chat about the hostile environment and what that says generally about whether how we feel as a we. This is not anything specific, but I'm talking as a nation, both within in Scotland, but also the rest of the UK. How does that show? What message does that sort of send really to people who have either decided to come here voluntarily or have come here because they're displaced migrants? What that means about their long-term future, and how people react to them, and how they feel themselves, and whether they belong, and whether they appreciate it for being here. So the hostile environment policy is certainly something which affects all aspects of migrants' lives, particularly displaced migrants. And as I said in my response in the chat, this is something that came up time and time again during the writing and researching of our report on labour market access. And the most obvious example of that, of course, is the fact that asylum seekers are denied the ability to work, and the ability to actually get into paid employment is a huge thing for people who have arrived in this country as displaced migrants, and many of them want to be able to do that. They want to be able to provide for themselves, provide for their families, and have that kind of dignity of being able to get a job. And when you're denied that, that's just one more example of you being feeling marginalized, essentially. So of course there are a lot of campaigns around this, UK-wide campaigns about allowing asylum seekers to work. The situation in the rest of Europe, of course, is very different. Each country has its own kind of rules. Some people having to wait maybe a matter of months. Some people can access the labour market within weeks. But it certainly seems to us, and many other people worked on this, that the policy of denying asylum seekers access to the labour market is very much counterproductive, both for the state, because that means they can't earn money for themselves, but also for migrants themselves, because that's delaying also this integration process. But of course, that's part and parcel of this hostile environment policy, is to supposedly not provide kind of pull factors for people coming to the UK. But certainly from the people we spoke to, from the stakeholders on the ground, the overwhelming message is that we should be allowing people, asylum seekers, to work, and making that process much easier, because that's going to help aid their integration. We can't say on the one hand, or we want people to integrate, and on the other hand say, well, no, actually you're not allowed to work. So there's also a sort of a contradiction there, and it's something that many people find very, very frustrating, this ability not to work, because it impacts on everything else. It impacts on people's mental health. It impacts on things like the ability to learn the English language. Well, if you're not given the opportunity to go and work and speak with native speakers, then how are you going to improve your language skills? So it has all these knock-on effects. And the hostile environment policy is something we do mention a lot in that report, and how that really does have a negative consequences in all aspects of people's daily lives and integration, but particularly perhaps the case for labour market integration, which obviously is something we've been focusing on particularly today.
Yeah, I was thinking on the point that both Simone and Tim said. I think that integration in the labour market is really connected to the topic of belonging, as they were saying. And in addition to the hostile environment, if we study and analyze all the employability policies that are promoted for, in particular, refugees and asylum seekers, they are very fragmented. And it's very difficult from the starting point when people arrive. So from recognition of skills, as Simone said in his presentation, to find a job, to convince employers to hire people, as Tim was saying in his presentation. I mean, there are really high barriers for integrating people in the labour market in Scotland, and doing something about that. So, for example, some of the suggestions that Tim did, as well Simone did, so involving employers and supporting really the integration in the labour market, I think would really affect positively the sense of belonging of people. So that was my point. So there are other policies in addition to the migration one that can be promoted also at Evolve Better that can change this.
Thank you. Carol?
I think I'd just like to really agree with what Francesca and Tim have said, and that importance of integration into employment of some form, because not every migrant refugee will come with higher level qualifications. So I think it's very much a rounded picture, and I think also there's some issues about access to information, and if I could just briefly perhaps give a shout out to the fact that our executive education department, in which Hilary is based, is providing some free online courses on right of abode, and also as a background to immigration law and policy in the UK, which have been produced with immigration judges and will be available in the late summer. And I think that having access to that information can also be benefit in terms of the individuals searching out for their own information. Thank
you. And Hilary?
Yeah, I'd just briefly like to just agree with you, Simon, on your point of precarity, because I found that really prevalent, certainly in previous studies I've done, notably within education. And the factor that was prevalent in our research was that this issue of precarity actually made people rethink who they are but become more collective. And so they weren't considering their own careers as individualistic. They were going back to who they were within the family setting and how they would get people moved and together. And of course, COVID has really hit people as well, because the travel restrictions have had an impact on that.
Okay, thank you. In a second, I'm going to give one last chance to each of the panel members to make a final and farewell comment, and then I'll wrap up the webinar. But I do want people to appreciate that the panel in particular can't answer all the questions while they're doing their presentation and so on. So we are scrutinizing the chat box. We will get back to you. I've got links to give people after the event. And we will be sending out a questionnaire. We are looking for collaboration and for ideas. And I think there's a kind of emerging collaboration amongst almost everybody who's been involved. And it would be useful to think of practical ideas. I've got one or two myself, which I'll come to last of all. But I'd like to thank everybody and to give the panel members one brief chance to add a final observation. Simone.
I think we all the research that we have been presenting today has provided evidence that we should discuss and perhaps convey even better to policymakers, together with civil society organizations that are around this table and out in our countries really making the difference. I would say in many cases much more effectively than any policy around. For really changing the scenario. I think we have all over Europe a very functional consideration of migration. So your question on belonging, there's very little concern on belonging issues around policymakers' mind in Europe. And we only approach newcomers with a really functional approach as far as they're helpful for our economies in particular, rather than our societies, sometimes also our societies. Well, I think research as ours have shown that there are many reasons to change this attitude, and we are not that few to believe that this has to be changed and we can change it. And I think we should have more concrete actions together, academia and civil society organization, to push forward another way to approach diversity and belonging.
Thank you. Thank you, Simone. Tim?
Yeah, well, I would second what Simone has just said there, and perhaps just my concluding thought would be the fact that, obviously we're discussing particularly the context of Scotland today. We do have an opportunity here in Scotland to try and sort of mark out a different path, and of course, to some extent, that has been done. It's great that we have, separate refugee integration strategy, for example, the New Scots strategy that was mentioned. But what I would like to say is that, it's not just about kind of words, there has to be also sort of money and policies behind that, because a lot of what we're coming up with in all our reports is saying, okay, it's great, the willingness is there, but there also has to be sort of more some concrete decisions need to be made, and there has to be sort of funding as well to support the kind of recommendations that not just I've been talking about today, but my colleagues and even people who've been posting in the chat.
Thank you, Tim. A few seconds each for Francesca, Carol and Hilary.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that after this event with Tim and Simone, we are gonna write up a policy brief based on our research, and we are gonna ask people to suggest ideas for future policies. So what we are gonna try to do as higher education institution is to promote something that can be related to more money and services in this topic.
Thank you. Carol?
Just simply that by working together, we can make a difference.
Thank you. And Hilary?
Practical point, we'll be putting this webinar and any associated blogs on the Open University FBL Executive Education website. So if anybody wants access to that, they can see what's been happening today.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the people behind the scenes from the Open University, Louise, Jennifer, Caroline, Derek, and many others. I'd like to thank, on your behalf, all the presenters and everybody involved in the project. Thank you to all the participants. And I'll just conclude with a very tiny step that people can make. In my experience, university staff use taxi drivers quite a lot, and taxi drivers are often migrants. And here at the Open University, Sarah de Jong, who's a research fellow in citizenship and governance, made a point of involving those taxi drivers in her fantastic research on inclusion and senses of belonging. That's perhaps the smallest step I can think of. But the biggest issue, I think, has been raised by Eva Hanna in the chat box, which I wanted to end with, which is, although naturally we're focused on survival, resilience, finding a job, developing language skills, universities and colleges are also about education for its own sake. And to make that as open to people, places, methods, and ideas as possible is a shared endeavor. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.